In March of 1879, a wooden box surfaced in the Thames near Barnes Bridge. Inside, human remains, boiled beyond recognition. Not murdered. Erased. Someone had taken a life and attempted to dissolve it, piece by piece, in boiling water, as if a human being could simply be rendered down and forgotten. The methodical horror of it whispered a question that would haunt Victorian London. What kind of person doesn't just kill but tries to unmake a victim entirely? The answer would lead investigators to a quiet household in Richmond, to a trusted servant who had lived, worked, and simmered with rage beneath the surface of daily routines. A woman who wore her victims' dresses. Who sold her victims' jewelry. Who, some would later claim, even tried to sell the boiled fat as cooking grease to unsuspecting neighbors. This was not a crime of passion. This was patience twisted into violence. Trust weaponized. A murder hidden in plain sight until the Thames gave up its terrible secret. Julia Martha Thomas had vanished from her cottage without a word. Her friends received no letters. Her home reeked of something foul. And her servant, Kate Webster, moved through Richmond in stolen silks, throwing parties with stolen wine, spinning stories that shifted like smoke. But underneath the lies, underneath the charm and deflection, there was copper. Boiling. The sound of something heavy being dragged across floorboards in the dead of night. By the time the truth emerged, it would reveal not just a murder, but a grotesque tableau of dismemberment, deception, and disposal so calculated that it shocked even hardened detectives. A servant had not only killed her mistress, she had tried to erase her from existence itself. The story of Kate Webster is not just about what happened in that Richmond cottage. It's about what happens when resentment festers in silence. When desperation meets opportunity. When the invisible women of Victorian society, the ones who cooked, cleaned, and obeyed, finally horrifically refused to disappear. This is that story. Julia Martha Thomas was 70 years old when she died. She lived alone at 2 Vine Cottages, Richmond, a modest but respectable address for a widow of modest means. Julia was known in the neighborhood as particular. Demanding, some said. She kept her home immaculate, her accounts precise, her routines unchanging. She attended church. She wrote letters. She preferred things done her way and she did not apologize for it. She was, in many ways, the embodiment of Victorian respectability, a woman who had outlived her husband and now maintained her independence through careful management of what little she had left. In January of 1879, Julia hired a new live-in servant. Her name was Kate Webster. Kate was Irish. 30 years old. Strong-built, sharp-tongued, and hardened by a life that had offered her little kindness. She had been in and out of prison, theft mostly, small crimes born of desperation. She had a son but she did not raise him. She had worked in various households but none for long. She was the kind of woman Victorian society preferred not to see, poor, foreign, marked by failure. But Julia needed help and Kate needed work. The arrangement should have been simple. It was not. From the beginning, tension crackled between them. Julia's expectations were high, Kate's patience thin. Julia noticed things going missing. Small items at first. A handkerchief. A piece of silverware. Kate bristled under constant supervision, under Julia's sharp corrections, under the weight of being watched and judged in every moment. 2 women. 1 house. No escape. Neighbors began to notice the arguments. Raised voices through thin walls. Julia confiding to friends that Kate was lazy, insubordinate, possibly dishonest. She planned to dismiss her. She had already begun looking for a replacement. Kate, for her part, seethed quietly. She had spent her life being discarded, by family, by employers, by a society that saw women like her as disposable. And now, here was another woman, wealthy enough to employ her but miserly enough to criticize every gesture, preparing to cast her out once again. The cottage was small. The work was endless. The resentment, mutual. Julia's routines continued. Church on Sundays. Marketing on Tuesdays. Tea with neighbors who noticed everything and gossiped freely. She moved through her life with the confidence of someone who believed the world operated according to rules, and that those rules would protect her. Kate's routines were different. She scrubbed floors. She hauled water. She smiled when required and vanished into the background when dismissed. She learned the rhythms of the house, when Julia slept, when she was distracted, when she was vulnerable. Neither woman could have known, in those cold February weeks of 1879, that their conflict would not end in dismissal. It would end in dismemberment. In boiling water and blood-soaked floorboards. In a wooden box floating in the Thames. But before the violence, there was just this. 2 women trapped together, resentment building like steam in a locked kettle, pressure rising with no release in sight. And on the night of February 28, something, or someone, finally broke. February 28, 1879. Neighbors heard something strange coming from 2 Vine cottages that evening. Thuds. Heavy, irregular. Then muffled sounds, scuffling, perhaps, or something being dragged. Then silence. The kind of silence that feels deliberate, as if someone is holding their breath. No one investigated. Victorian propriety discouraged such intrusions. What happened behind closed doors was private, even when the sounds suggested otherwise. The next morning, Julia Martha Thomas did not appear. Kate Webster did. She emerged from the cottage wearing one of Julia's dresses, a detail that immediately struck neighbors as odd. Kate was a servant. Servants did not wear their mistress's clothing. When asked, Kate explained smoothly, Mrs. Thomas had gone away on sudden business. Family matters. She would be gone for some time. But the explanation didn't quite fit. Julia had mentioned no travel plans. She had scheduled a church meeting for that week. Her routines were predictable, this departure was not. And then there was the smell. A thick, greasy odor began seeping from the cottage. Neighbors couldn't place it at first, something cooking, perhaps, but wrong. Too heavy. Too persistent. It clung to the air, particularly strong near the kitchen window. Kate's behavior grew stranger. She began selling Julia's belongings, furniture, jewelry, clothing. She told a local pawnbroker that Mrs. Thomas no longer needed these items, that she had given them to Kate as payment. The pawnbroker hesitated. The story felt off. But Kate was insistent, almost aggressive. Then she threw a party. In Julia's cottage. Using Julia's glassware. Serving Julia's wine. Neighbors whispered. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. One woman saw Kate late at night, struggling with heavy boxes, loading them onto a cart. Another heard the sound of boiling water, for hours relentlessly, as if Kate were rendering something down in the kitchen. But no one had seen Julia Thomas. Not her silhouette in the window. Not her familiar figure walking to church. Not even a letter in her handwriting. Kate's stories began to shift. First, Julia had gone to visit family. Then she had moved abroad. Then, she had left instructions for Kate to manage the household in her absence. Each version contradicted the last. And beneath it all, the smell. The boxes. The sold belongings. The borrowed dresses. The growing certainty among neighbors that something unspeakable had happened in that cottage, and that Kate Webster was not telling the truth. They just didn't know yet how right they were. Or how horrifying the truth would be. The whispers grew louder. Julia Thomas's friends received no replies to their letters. Her church seat remained empty. Her daily routines, so predictable, so unchanging, had simply ceased. And Kate Webster moved through Richmond like a woman wearing someone else's life. She appeared at local shops in Julia's finest dresses, her bonnets, her jewelry. She carried herself with a strange confidence, as if daring anyone to question her. When neighbors asked after Mrs. Thomas, Kate's answers became increasingly elaborate. Julia was in Liverpool. No, she was traveling to Ireland. No, she had decided to stay with distant relatives indefinitely. The stories never aligned. On March 2, 1879, something surfaced in the Thames near Barnes Bridge. A wooden box, waterlogged and heavy. Inside, human remains. A torso. Limbs. All of it boiled, the flesh partially rendered, the bones exposed in places where the process had been most thorough. There was no head. No feet. Nothing that could easily identify the victim. But it was clearly murder. The police began their investigation. Meanwhile, Kate's movements became more erratic. She tried to sell Julia's furniture to a local dealer, claiming she had inherited it. The dealer hesitated. The furniture was good quality, the story suspicious. He stalled, asked questions. Kate grew agitated and left. She approached a friend, Mrs. Porter, asking if she could store some items temporarily. Heavy boxes. She didn't specify what was inside. Mrs. Porter agreed, uneasy but unwilling to refuse outright. Then Kate tried to sell a large copper pot, the kind used for boiling laundry or rendering fat or cooking in large quantities. A grocer remembered selling it to her weeks earlier. She had been insistent, urgent, as if she needed it immediately. Now she wanted to be rid of it. Neighbors began comparing notes. One had seen Kate carrying something heavy down to the river late at night. Another had heard screaming, brief, cut short, on the evening of February 28th. A third had noticed bloodstains near the cottage's back door, hastily scrubbed but still visible in certain light. The smell persisted. Greasy. Organic. Wrong. Someone approached the police. A search of 2 Vine cottages began. Officers found blood in the cracks of the floorboards. Burned bone fragments in the fireplace. Human fat residue in the copper pot, thick, rendered, unmistakable. In the garden, buried shallowly, they found more remains. The investigation turned to Kate Webster. But by then she had fled. She moved to Hammersmith, staying with acquaintances, still wearing Julia's clothing, still spinning stories. She told one friend that Mrs. Thomas had been kind enough to give her everything. She told another that she was owed money, that Julia had promised her these belongings. She was charming, persuasive. But the net was closing. Police tracked her movements. Witnesses came forward. A porter who had helped her move boxes, a cart driver who remembered the smell, a pawnbroker who had grown suspicious of her insistence. On March 10, Kate fled to Ireland using a false name. She stayed with her family, tried to blend back into her old life, perhaps believing distance would protect her. It did not. British authorities contacted Irish police. Kate Webster was arrested on March 29. She gave a false name. Then another. She claimed innocence, confusion, mistaken identity. But when confronted with the evidence, the blood, the bones, the witnesses, the copper pot, her composure cracked. She admitted to being present when Julia Thomas died. But she blamed someone else. A man, she said. A phantom accomplice named Henry Porter. He had killed Julia. He had forced Kate to help dispose of the body. She was a victim too, coerced, terrified. Investigators searched for Henry Porter. He did not exist. Kate had invented him. Another story, another deflection, another attempt to escape the truth. But the truth was already clear. Julia Thomas had been murdered in her own home, by the woman she had trusted to serve her. And what followed the murder was not panic, but process. Kate had spent hours, perhaps days, methodically dismembering Julia's body, boiling the pieces to destroy identifying features, and scattering the remains across London. This was not a crime of sudden rage. This was calculated, deliberate, cold. And the full horror of it was only beginning to emerge. The evidence spoke in fragments. Police returned to 2 Vine cottages with forensic experts and began the grim work of reconstruction. What they found painted a picture so methodical, so calculated, that even seasoned investigators recoiled. Blood had seeped into the floorboards near the staircase, scrubbed but not erased. Chemical tests revealed its presence in cracks, under rugs, in places Kate had tried desperately to clean but could not fully reach. In the kitchen, the copper pot still carried residue. Human fat, rendered down through prolonged boiling. The smell that neighbors had noticed, thick, greasy, persistent, was the smell of flesh being dissolved. Burned bone fragments littered the fireplace. Small pieces, calcined from intense heat, mixed with ordinary ash as if Kate had tried to disguise them among the remnants of coal fires. In the garden, more remains. Buried shallowly, hastily, as if disposal had become urgent. But the most disturbing discovery was not what was found. It was what was missing. Julia Thomas's head and feet had never surfaced in the Thames. They had not been found in the cottage or the garden. Kate had disposed of them separately, more carefully, as if she understood that these were the parts most likely to identify her victim. Without a head, without dental records or facial recognition, Julia Thomas might have remained nameless, just another tragic mystery in the Thames. But the community knew. Julia's friends, her neighbors, her church congregation, they all knew she was gone. And they knew Kate Webster was responsible. Under interrogation, Kate's stories continued to shift. First, she denied everything. Then she admitted being present but blamed the fictional Henry Porter. Then, slowly as the evidence mounted, she began to confess in pieces. Julia had fallen down the stairs, Kate claimed. An accident. She had panicked, not knowing what to do. But forensic examination of the remains told a different story. Julia's injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. There were signs of blunt force trauma, deliberate, repeated. She had been struck, likely strangled or bludgeoned, then dismembered post-mortem. Kate had not panicked. She had planned. Witnesses came forward with chilling details. A neighbor recalled Kate asking to borrow a large knife, claiming she needed it for cutting meat. Another remembered Kate purchasing heavy twine, the kind used for binding parcels. The copper pot had been bought days before Julia's death. Kate had carried it home herself, insisting she needed it immediately. The prosecution built a timeline. On the evening of February 28, Kate attacked Julia, likely pushing her down the stairs, then finishing the murder with blunt force or strangulation. She spent the night and following day dismembering the body. The process was slow, methodical. She used knives, a saw, possibly a cleaver. She worked in the kitchen, the same space where she had prepared Julia's meals. Then came the boiling. Kate filled the copper pot with water and body parts, heating it over the kitchen fire for hours. The process rendered flesh, softened tissue, made bones brittle. It reduced Julia Thomas to fragments that could be more easily concealed or discarded. The smell had been unbearable. Kate opened windows, burned incense, tried to mask it. But neighbors noticed. They always noticed. She packed some remains into the wooden box and dumped it in the Thames, likely hoping the current would carry it far from Richmond, far from suspicion. Other pieces went into the garden. Some were burned in the fireplace. And the head and feet, those she buried elsewhere. Possibly in a friend's garden, possibly in a public space, possibly somewhere she believed they would never be found. But perhaps the most grotesque detail emerged during witness testimony. A neighbor claimed Kate had offered her a bowl of dripping, rendered fat used for cooking. The neighbor had declined. She had found the texture strange, the smell off, the offer itself unusual. Later, she would wonder with horror if Kate had been trying to dispose of Julia Thomas's remains by giving them away as food. The claim was never proven. But it lingered in the public imagination, adding another layer of revulsion to an already monstrous case. Kate Webster had not just murdered Julia Thomas. She had tried to erase her, piece by piece, through fire, water, and deception. And she had nearly succeeded. If the Thames had not given up its secret, if neighbors had not been so observant, if Julia had not been so predictable in her routines, Kate might have walked away. But the evidence was undeniable. And the trial was coming. Kate Webster's trial began on July 2, 1879 at the Old Bailey. The courtroom was packed. The case had gripped Victorian London, not just because of the murder but because of the method. The dismemberment. The boiling. The cold, calculated disposal. This was not a crime of passion. This was something else entirely. Kate stood in the dock, defiant. She wore black as if in mourning, though whether for her victim or her own fate was unclear. She answered questions with carefully measured words, her tone alternating between victimhood and indignation. The prosecution presented their case methodically. First, the evidence from 2 vine cottages. Blood in the floorboards. Fat residue in the copper pot. Burned bone fragments in the fireplace. The remains from the Thames, positively identified through clothing remnants and physical characteristics as belonging to Julia Thomas. Then the witnesses. Neighbors testified to the sounds they had heard on February 28, the thuds, the dragging, the hours of boiling water. The grocer who sold Kate the copper pot. The pawnbroker who had grown suspicious of her insistence. The porter who helped move the heavy boxes, noting their terrible weight and Kate's nervous urgency. Julia's friends testified to her routines, her predictability, the impossibility that she would simply vanish without word. The forensic experts explained the process of dismemberment, the level of effort required, the time it would have taken. This was not a panicked act. This was sustained, deliberate work. And then came the most damning testimony of all. Mrs. Porter, Kate's acquaintance, admitted that Kate had asked her to store items, including boxes she refused to open. Later, when police searched Mrs. Porter's property, they found more remains. Kate had dispersed Julia Thomas across London, hiding pieces with friends in rivers, in gardens, as if scattering evidence would scatter guilt. The defense was weak. Kate's lawyer argued that she had been coerced, that the mysterious Henry Porter had forced her participation. But investigators had found no trace of such a man. No witnesses had seen him. Kate's descriptions of him changed with each telling. The jury was not convinced. Kate changed her story once more on the stand. She admitted that Julia had confronted her about theft. They had argued. Julia had threatened to dismiss her without references, which would have made finding new work nearly impossible. In a moment of rage, Kate claimed she had pushed Julia down the stairs. But even this version fell apart under scrutiny. The injuries, the dismemberment, the boiling. None of it suggested a momentary loss of control. The prosecution painted a different picture. Kate had grown to hate Julia Thomas. She resented her demands, her criticisms, her authority. She had planned the murder, or at the very least, had not hesitated when the opportunity arose. And afterward, she had not sought help or confessed in panic. She had stolen Julia's identity, worn her dresses, sold her belongings, thrown parties in her home, tried to profit from her death. This was not the behavior of someone who had accidentally killed in self-defense. This was the behavior of someone who believed she could get away with it. The trial lasted just days. The jury deliberated for little more than an hour. Guilty. Kate showed no emotion as the verdict was read. She stood rigid, silent, as if the word had not quite reached her. The judge sentenced her to death by hanging. In the days that followed, Kate confessed more fully. She admitted to the murder, to the dismemberment, to the disposal. She revealed that Julia's head and feet had been buried in the garden of a friend, a location police searched but never fully excavated. Those remains were never recovered. Kate Webster was asked if she felt remorse. She offered vague statements about regret, about wishing things had been different. But there was no true contrition in her words. No acknowledgement of Julia Thomas as a person, a life, a loss. Only self-preservation even at the end. On July 29, 1879, Kate Webster was hanged at Wandsworth Prison. She was 30 years old. She died without revealing the full truth of what had happened in that cottage, or why she had chosen such a monstrous method of disposal. Some questions, it seemed, would remain forever unanswered. Kate Webster was hanged at dawn. She walked to the gallows calmly, her composure unbroken even at the end. Her final words were brief, vague, an acknowledgement of guilt but no real apology. No tearful confession. No plea for forgiveness from Julia Thomas's family. Just silence. And then the drop. Richmond reacted with a mixture of horror and fascination. Newspapers across Britain sensationalized the case. The Richmond Murderess, they called her. The boiling killer. Illustrations depicted Kate as monstrous, inhuman, a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking within ordinary households. But for those who had known Julia Thomas, the spectacle felt hollow. Julia was dead. Her body incomplete. Her life reduced to headlines and courtroom testimony. She had been a woman of routines, of modest dignity, of independence hard-won in a society that did not make space for widows of limited means. And she had been erased, not just killed but systematically dismantled, as if her existence could be undone through fire and water. Two Vine cottages became infamous. For years locals avoided it. Whispers clung to the address. Eventually, it was demolished, the land repurposed, the physical structure of the crime removed from sight. But the memory remained. The case left lingering questions. Could anyone have prevented it? Had neighbors noticed the warning signs too late, or simply chosen not to act? Could Julia have dismissed Kate sooner, before resentment hardened into violence? And what of Kate herself? Was she born capable of such cruelty, or had desperation and rage transformed her into something unrecognizable? Victorian society preferred simple narratives. Kate was a monster. Julia was a victim. The trial was justice. But the truth was murkier. Kate Webster was poor, Irish, criminalized, discarded by a society that saw women like her as expendable. Julia Thomas was isolated, demanding, trapped in a household where power dynamics festered unseen. The murder did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a world where servants were invisible until they became dangerous. Where women's labor was undervalued until it turned violent. Where resentment could simmer for weeks, unnoticed, until it boiled over into horror. Kate Webster's name would endure in criminal history, not because she was unique, but because her crime was so methodical, so grotesque, that it could not be forgotten. And Julia Thomas, despite everything, would be remembered. Not just as a victim but as a woman who lived, who had routines and friends and a life that mattered, even if it took a century for the world to finally return her remains. The story of Kate Webster did not end with her execution. For more than a century Julia Thomas's head and feet remained missing, lost to history, lost to the Thames, lost to whatever dark corner Kate had chosen for their burial. And then, in 2010, something extraordinary happened. Sir David Attenborough, the renowned naturalist, was working in his garden in Richmond when builders unearthed a human skull. The property had once been part of the land adjacent to two Vine cottages. The skull was sent for analysis. DNA testing, forensic reconstruction, historical records. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. It was Julia Martha Thomas. After 131 years she had been found. The discovery brought renewed attention to the case. Historians revisited the trial records, the witness testimonies, the forensic reports. The story was re-examined through a modern lens, not just as a sensational crime, but as a window into the lives of Victorian women trapped in impossible circumstances. Kate Webster's case became significant in forensic history. It was one of the earliest documented instances where dismemberment and disposal methods were meticulously analyzed in court. The use of boiling to destroy identifying features, the calculated scattering of remains, these were techniques that would appear in future criminal cases, studied by investigators seeking to understand the psychology of such acts. But beyond the forensics, the case revealed something darker about Victorian society. Domestic servants lived in their employers' homes, invisible and essential. They knew every routine, every vulnerability, every moment when their employers were alone. The relationship was built on trust, but also on power, inequality and mutual dependence. When that balance tipped, the results could be catastrophic. Kate Webster was not the first servant to kill an employer, nor the last. But her crime stood out for its calculated brutality, its methodical erasure of a human life. Julia Thomas's skull was finally laid to rest with the other remains recovered during the original investigation. Her story, incomplete for so long, was now whole. And the case endures, not just as Victorian horror, but as a reminder that beneath the surface of any household, any relationship built on unequal power, darkness can simmer unseen until it boils over into violence.